as well. So there you have it. That's the latest with the rural vote in those two states.
Absolutely, and that's clearly what made the difference in some of these states. Thank you very much. Now that the American voters have spoken and selected President-elect Donald Trump to take over the White House, there are many questions now percolating, including, but not, of course, limited to the Supreme Court. During the election, Trump made Supreme Court nominations a key part of his platform. He promised to appoint conservative judges. He even released a special list. Now, what bearing will that have on Roe v. Wade? A big topic at the debates. Joining me now is Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, an MSNBC contributor and professor of Mexican-American Studies at the University of Texas. And back with me, David Corn, Washington Bureau Chief at Mother Jones and an MSNBC political analyst. Victoria, there is a theory that among the other things that happened at the end of this race, the unusual insertion of the FBI, clearly some turnout models that started to shift as both campaigns hustled to places like Pennsylvania and Michigan that weren't necessarily supposed to be decisive. The other thing was conservatives talking a lot about the Supreme Court, whether they like Donald Trump or not, the import of that with a vacancy overhanging. Your view on whether that was a key factor?
I think it was one of the key factors. I think that you had a number of Republicans, and living in Texas, I talked to many of these Republicans who were Bush-style Republicans and did not like Trump, but they said to me, I'm going to put on a dozen clothespins on my nose, and I'm going to go into the ballot box and vote to keep the Supreme Court, because we don't want Hillary Clinton naming the next or second or third Supreme Court justice. So I think that was a factor. The other big factor, Ari, is I think that we need to have a come-to-Jesus moment with our pollsters and our methodology. Pretty much all of the polling was wrong. So we need to figure out, what are we missing with our samples? What are we missing with our technology? What are we missing? So I think that, together with what we underestimated as the strength of Republican voters who don't like Trump, but just went ahead and voted for him anyways.
Let me push you on that. You raise an interesting point, but I think your premise is that we need accurate polling so that we can predict the outcome in advance. A counter-argument would be, for most of American history, we didn't have such a big polling industrial complex. Everyone got along fine. Maybe people kept a more open mind going into Election Day. Maybe what we learned over the last 2 days is, in some races, and this was an unusual race, you should throw the polls out the window, pay less attention to them, and just see what the voters decide.
I'll admit it. I came up during the golden age of polling, where up until the last election, you could pretty much predict the outcome of the election by the polls. And I think that is a valid point, Ari. And I was gonna say go to bed with that, but I'm going to stay up the rest of the morning thinking about that, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's not about the polls, it's what the American people want. And the American people spoke very clearly tonight, whether you like it or not.
David?
Well, I think, you know, when it comes to the polling, that's not the problem what the Democrats had. The problem was with organizing and getting out their vote. I mean, the polls show us where they underperformed. And I mean, I think you bring up a great point with, you know, with SCOTUS, with the Supreme Court, because now we see what are the ramifications and how is Donald Trump going to govern. Now, liberals didn't like it when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980. Some of us are old enough to remember that. But he brought in Don Regan and James Baker. Now, these were sort of establishment-type Republicans. Liberals didn't like their policies, but they recognized that they were experts in their field and they were serious people. The question is, Donald Trump, who isn't a fellow who has a long attention span and not necessarily a guy who, you know, cares about details when it comes to policies. You know, he's talked about having Rudy Giuliani and Newt Gingrich as making up the core of his cabinet. These two fellows are not great counters to the deficits that Donald Trump has.
Well, David, you're raising the question, will he form a cabinet and a bureaucracy, if he can, in his own image?
Or will he work with the existing Republican establishment in Washington and actually accept some of their recommendations on who knows something about policy matters? This is an establishment that he has been at odds with, and one thing we know about Donald Trump, he's a very vengeful guy. He says this over and over again. I screw people who screw me, I screw them 10 times over. So will he be able to make amends? Because it takes a lot to run the federal government. And, you know, you just can't do it with the people on his small team. And, you know, this really is an issue of security and safety for the entire nation.
So, Victoria, let me go back to you just briefly as a final thought. Doesn't this also go to the question of which Donald Trump are we going to get? Is it the Donald Trump who ran on the Muslim ban for months and then tried to say, oh, well, really, it's about security vetting, who ran on the wall and said, I'm going to build it, you wait, it's going to be the biggest, best wall, but then had his aides later say, well, maybe it's a cyber cyber wall. You know, for a guy who denounces politically correct speech, he has moved around when expedient for him. Which one do we get?
Which Donald Trump is going to move into the White House? I'm going to be an optimist here, and I'm going to hope that the Donald Trump that we see as president is the Donald Trump that gave the acceptance speech tonight, that said, I want to put behind us all of the divisions. I want to come together as a nation. I want to unify our country. That is my hope, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that.
Well, and that is, look, I'll be interested to watch. That is a Donald Trump who is disagreeing in essence with what he ran on, which was lock her up. That's what they ran on. We should jail our political opponents regardless of what the FBI finds, regardless of what the facts might show. One speech doesn't unwind a year campaign, but we will find out. Sometimes governing is different than campaigning. I want to thank Victoria DeFrancesco and David Korn for joining us tonight. Appreciate it. Tonight and this morning, I should say, depending on